So in this class, we'll try to understand the pathophysiology of ARDS. How does it impact management? And what are the challenges in management? In fact, the second two parts, how does it impact management and the challenges, will be merged as the discussion goes on, because they are almost looking at the same things. And I want you to keep your pens and book ready for answering questions. It's a self-assessment, and you can answer yourself, and then you can check whether your answers are right when I give the answer. There are some references which I'll be quoting from and which are there displayed during the talk, and you can note down because they're all good references. The coffee is optional. I promise to be incomplete. I will not cover all aspects of ARDS because it is impossible. And I purposely don't want to cover everything because there must be something for you to go back and read. There must be some questions in your mind which you would like to address rather than my giving all the data. So let's start. 65-year-old lady comes with fever 3 days, URTI, and increasing breathlessness. Now, what is the diagnosis? And look at the second problem. A 60-year-old diabetic has burning micturition of 3 days duration and high-grade fever. He feels weak and tired. He has breathlessness. Saturation on arrival is 85%. What is the diagnosis? Now, both have the same diagnosis. Both are ARDS, but both are coming from different routes. The first lady who has got a fever of 3 days and a URTI probably has a lung infection and an ARDS. This is a diabetic who has got a urinary tract infection, high-grade fever, possibly a pyelonephritis going on to, and then he's got an ARDS. So what I want to emphasize is that ARDS is a syndrome. It's not a disease. It's a syndrome. It's an endpoint of many, many diseases. So that is why there is heterogeneity in the presentation. There's heterogeneity in the management. And that is why it cannot, every patient with ARDS cannot be managed the same way. And as we know, the cause of the ARDS must always be addressed. So the cause is different. So the treatment of the cause will always be different. So let's remember that we are not talking about one disease. It was first described by Oshberg and colleagues in 1967. At that time, it was described as a severe lung injury characterized by non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema, decreased lung compliance, and refractory hypoxemia. Now, they got most of it right even in 1967 because it is a severe lung injury. It is a non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema. There is a stiff lung, so there's decreased lung compliance, and there is a refractory hypoxemia, which is the theme of ARDS. Now, the AACC consensus in 1994 defined ARDS into two categories, the acute lung injury and the ARDS, which they divided based on the PF ratio. And they said acute onset, you got a PF ratio less than 300, bilateral infiltrates on the chest radiograph, and a wedge pressure less than 18, which tells you that there is no left heart involvement. That means there is no cardiac cause. If you had this, you called it as an acute lung injury. And if you had less than 200, you called it as an ARDS. So the timing, the oxygenation, the chest radiograph, and the exoneration of the heart. These were the four basic features in 1994. So what's the problem with these definitions? Why we ran into trouble with these definitions? Now, the first thing is that bilateral chest infiltrates. We all know that when you all read the chest radiograph, maybe AI will come in and then maybe make it all uniform, but otherwise no two professors will agree on a chest X-ray. So there's an intra-observer variation, and that can lead to somebody calling it bilateral infiltrate, somebody calling it patchy, somebody calling it something else, etc. So there is a problem in that bilateral infiltrates. There's always this question, is it ARDS or is it pulmonary edema? Every time you see a chest X-ray, that question is asked to you, and sometimes you can't even differentiate the two. The differentiating features, if they are present, are that in a pulmonary edema, you'll get cardiomegaly, you'll get a bat swing appearance. Here it's more peripheral. There is no cardiomegaly in ARDS. There's upper lobe diversion of the veins. There's no preference here, no air bronchogram. There can be an air bronchogram here. And the response to treatment is dramatic. In a pulmonary edema, once you give the diuretic, the response to treatment, especially at the patient level, is dramatic, whereas this always takes much more time to resolve. So these are some differences that we can make out, but none of them is 100% right. Now, when we talked about hypoxemia and the PF ratio, what we did not factor in was the PEEP. So if you had a PEEP, what would your PF ratio be? So that part was not taken into account in the initial definition, and that is why several articles came in criticizing the definition of ARDS without defining at what level of PEEP this PF ratio was done. We also said that we would exonerate the heart by saying that the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure is less than 18. But what you find in real life is that in ARDS, you do get a pulmonary artery wedge pressure, which is more than 18 in about 82% of the patients. So you can see that there is an overlap. There is an overlap which cannot be separated out in real life. Now let's look at this problem. A 35-year-old laborer comes with a fever of 4 days duration and breathlessness of 2 days duration. On examination is hypoxic bilateral cramps. What are your possibilities? And a 70-year-old diabetic with ischemic heart disease comes with 2 days fever, cough, and breathlessness. What is the diagnosis? Please write down a diagnosis for this. Write down a diagnosis for this. The context is the diagnosis, isn't it? So when we are talking of, is it ARDS, is it pulmonary edema, you would definitely think this is pulmonary edema because this man is old, he's a diabetic, he's got ischemic heart disease, he's got probably a respiratory infection, and then he's gone in for a acute on chronic cardiac failure. That's what you would think. Whereas this person, 35-year-old laborer, obviously no major comorbidities, 4 days fever, 2 days breathlessness, that's an acute febrile illness, and that's probably an ARDS on an acute febrile illness. So where did we get the diagnosis from? We got it from the context, which was not specified in the definition. So if we sum up the criticism of the AACC, the acute onset, there was no time limit given for the acute onset. Then there was one confusing category of ALI. The oxygenation, there was no this thing regardless of the PEEP. The PEEP was not factored in. The bilateral chest radiograph problems, the inter-observer reliability was not taken into account. Then we talked about the pulmonary artery wedge pressure, which again can coexist even in an ARDS. And risk factors, like we said, the context was not defined in the definition. So that is why the critical care medicine societies came together and said they must update the definition of ARDS based on current epidemiological evidence, physiological concepts, and results of clinical trials with the feasibility, reliability, and validity. We must be able to measure these things. They must be reliable and they must be valid. Okay, then only we can call it, and that's how the Berlin definition of ARDS came in. Now, Berlin definition tried to address most of these things by saying that the timing is within 1 week. The bilateral opacity is not explained by effusion, lobar lung collapse, or nodules. This was added. The origin of the edema not explained by cardiac failure or fluid overload. That's why better to do an echocardiography. And we defined the categories into mild, moderate, and severe based on the PF ratio with the factoring in of a PEEP. With putting in the PEEP, we called it. So we tried to address most of the criticism of the AACC definition by the Berlin definition. Now that's how the Berlin definition came in: acute onset, bilateral opacities, hypoxemia, with the PEEP coming there, identifiable risk factor for ARDS, and exclude cardiac failure and not excluded due to cardiac causes. Now then came COVID, and then we have this high frequency nasal oxygen. And then we were thinking, what happened to the PEEP here? We know that when we run the flow of more than 40 liters, we do get a 5 PEEP. So we can still use your definition for an ARDS with the HFNO, possible. But the point is, we must remember, why do we define? If there are so many problems and so many caveats in everything, why do we define? Two things we must remember. One is that the definition is only for clinical trials. It's really not for real life. Nobody is going to pin down a patient saying, oh, you have ARDS, you don't have ARDS. You want to know what to do for this patient to get better. That's all. It doesn't matter what name you call him. You can call him any disease, but try to get him better. So definitions are more for recruitment for clinical trials, and definitions can change with time, because the definition of sepsis changed so many times. In fact, we had a definition of sepsis which equated a tonsillitis with a septic shock. We had a definition like that also, because everybody said tachycardia, high-grade fever, and this thing, neutrophil count being high was sepsis. We came from that point. So the point is, definitions are never written in gold. Definitions are never very categorical, and they should be probably thought of for recruitment for clinical trials. In real life, all we need to know is to understand how to manage a patient. That's all the reason for definition. How big is the problem? What is the epidemiology of the thing? Okay, now we know that acute lung injury, when it was defined, was this number per 1 lakh person years, and acute ARDS was so many cases. So it's not a common disease. It's not a common disease when you take a population, but you got a good amount of patients in the ICU with ARDS, and these numbers are only increased tremendously after COVID. A study from Vellore, I think it was 2014 or something, I've not written it here, where they said 902 patients were included, 233 had one risk factor and 39 had multiple risk factor. Incidence was 11. Okay, so in an ICU, you definitely get a good proportion of patients with ARDS, and now with COVID coming in, I think there is no other cause for an ICU admission except ARDS. It's come to that level. Now, the commonest cause of ARDS in the ICU is, just answer, this sepsis. So that's a huge proportion, 27 to 37% of ARDS in the ICU. Of course, now COVID has beaten up everybody else in this race, but otherwise it is sepsis. Gram positive or negative? That's a negative. Okay. Gram negative sepsis is the commonest cause of ARDS in any ICU that you come across if you leave out COVID from this equation. Now, the causes of ARDS you can pick up from any book. So I'm not going into the details. It can be either direct lung injury or indirect. Direct lung injury, the most common cause is a pneumonia or an aspiration, and everything else is not so important. And the indirect lung injury, it's a sepsis, and then the other causes you can pick up from any book. What I wanted to show you is some unusual causes that we have to focus on. Like we said, we have common precedents of ARDS, pneumonia being this thing, and non-pulmonary sepsis. These are the two things that are coming in the beginning at the top of the list. But you have less common precedents like smoke inhalation, drowning. We just heard about the Diwali crackers in Delhi causing, probably there may be a spike in COVID. That is because an ARDS is always precipitated by a smoke inhalation, any other cause of ARDS, but direct smoke inhalation can also cause ARDS, as happens with the burning of cashew nut peels in South Canara. And also the vape and e-cigarette use is also a cause of ARDS. And if you look at the differential for an ARDS, you find a lot of causes like this, like vasculitis, diffuse alveolar hemorrhage, organizing pneumonia. The ILD part, the ILD component of, acute lung injury, I mean, they are the ones which will come as differentials for an ARDS. They cannot be really called as ARDS because their cause is different. So like we said, pneumonia, severe sepsis take the major chunk of ARDS in any ICU, any part of the world. But in our country, apart from gram-negative sepsis, gram-positive infections, you have this whole host of tropical illnesses, dengue, lepto, H1N1, malaria, scrub typhus, HIV, and then now COVID. So all of them are very, very important causes of ARDS. So if you stand in an ICU and count the number of people with ARDS, try to give them a diagnosis, most of them will fall within one of these diagnoses. And like we said, the current diagnosis is COVID-19. You can see starting out from the peripheral shadows, increasing, and then finishing off the whole of the lung. And that is our fate for the past 1.5 to 2 years. The risk factors for ARDS are tobacco use, alcohol use, hypoalbuminemia, chemotherapy. Like we said, ambient air pollutant exposure, and people with diabetes somehow were less likely to develop ARDS. There were some studies like that, but not in COVID. In COVID, diabetes is a very bad risk factor. But otherwise, these are the things that can cause a predisposition to the ARDS. Now, how do you make a diagnosis of ARDS? Most of the time it is clinical, because the clinical history provides the information regarding the duration. Remember, it must be less than 1 week. An infectious prodrome, a travel history, exposures, behaviors, localizing symptoms, and comorbidities like these, which are predisposing to any infection. And then sterile ARDS, like in blunt trauma, multiple blood transfusions, pancreatitis, postoperative, etc., etc. So the background is very, very important. But that is only half the story. Most of the time in most diseases, we ignore the host. The point is, who will get ARDS and who will survive depends upon a lot of host factors which are underemphasized and probably very important in the future. That's where the genetics in ARDS comes in. Now, like we said, there's an environment which predisposes to ARDS, maybe the host, maybe the environment, whatever. But you have got genetic markers like at the level of the DNA, at the RNA. You remember the microRNAs are a big thing all over medicine today. When you talk of diabetes, when you talk of cardiac failure, like that, the microRNAs are making their way into ARDS also. The proteomics and the metabolomics, all these things are important, and they are the genetic markers of an ARDS, which is ultimately the phenotype which is expressed is based on the interaction between the environment and these. Just to give an idea of how it will all look like when you do this kind of research in an ARDS, you find out a particular metabolite either in the exhaled breath or in the ball or in the plasma, and then you make out whether these are more common in an ARDS or not. This is probably the future. This is not what we are doing now, but probably in the future, these would make a huge impact on who will get ARDS and who will survive, which is the host factor. Now, coming to the pathophysiology. The war zone in an ARDS is the alveocapillary membrane, and the alveocapillary membrane permeability is the ultimate limiting factor in an ARDS. So you got the alveoli here, you got the vessel here, and that's the RBC here. And this alveocapillary membrane is where the battle is fought in an ARDS. Now, if you look at the normal alveolus and the injured alveolus, look at the normal alveolus, it's got one type 1 cell, it's got a type 2 cell, then you got the epithelial basement membrane, there is an interstitium, there is a nice capillary here, there is a surfactant layer, and an alveolar macrophage which is likely to defend you against infection, because you remember the respiratory tract is an open tract. You're breathing in bacteria every second. Whereas an injured alveolus during the acute phase of an ARDS looks like that. It's got everything going wrong. There is a release of cytokines from the alveolar macrophage, which is causing this TNF alpha, IL-8, IL-6, IL-10, IL-1. All these are coming out. The leukotrienes are coming out. The proteases are coming out. There is a neutrophil which is completely activated. There's an inactivated surfactant which causes collapse. And there's a denuded basement membrane here. And this leads to migration of neutrophils and proteases. And there is a separation of the alveocapillary membrane. Remember, that is the alveolus, this is a capillary, and this is the interstitium, where you got the fluid, widened edematous interstitium is sitting there. Now, if you look at that, you will find that if you aspirate, you're damaging the membrane from that side, that is from the alveolar side. If you got a sepsis, you're damaging the membrane from this side, which is the vascular side. Ultimately, it is the alveocapillary membrane which is the site of damage, which is causing a problem with diffusion, which is causing the hypoxia of ARDS. So these cytokines attract neutrophils, and the neutrophils come in and then they damage the alveolar membrane, and there is a damage of type 1 cells and there is a damage of type 2 cells, which causes decreased surfactant. But we also remember that whatever fluid comes in, it's not being reabsorbed also. There's a hyperpermeable alveolar membrane and it fills up the interstitium with the proteinaceous fluid, and the surfactant can no longer support the alveolus. So you can see the nice surfactant supporting the alveolus here. This is causing alveolar collapse because you don't have the surfactant and there is no reabsorption of fluid. But the most important or the beginning of the whole story is the permeable alveolar membrane, which is destroyed by the presence of these cytokines, and it is also causing coagulation at the vascular part. Now that's a more simplified diagram of what happens. Now, like we said, alveolar macrophage activation, hyaline membrane deposition, neutrophil migration. What we underestimate or what we underemphasize is the activation of the coagulation and inhibition of fibrinolysis, which happens on the vascular side because of endothelial cell activation and addition molecule expression. There is a damage to the capillary also. Then there is alveolar edema. Later on, there is fibroblast activation. There is surfactant inactivation causing collapse of the alveoli. Like I said, the normal healthy pulmonary endothelium inhibits inflammation and coagulation. Remember, inflammation and coagulation, there is always a crosstalk, right? Every inflammation can cause coagulation. So there is an activation of the coagulation pathway. So there's an inhibition of the inflammation and coagulation by the normal endothelium. But the damaged endothelium does exactly the opposite. It is stimulated by hypoxia, cytokines, chemokines, thrombin, primed leukocytes like lipopolysaccharides and the DAMPs. All of them are stimuli for activation of the vasculature, which causes thrombosis. So there is a gap between the endothelial cells that causes leak, and tissue factor is activated, triggering coagulation. So you got damage on the alveolar side, you got an alveocapillary leak, you got an interstitium which is flooded, and on the other side you got a coagulation. So everything together is what is causing ARDS. The neutrophils in ARDS are peculiar. They are not the normal neutrophils. They have enhanced chemotaxis, enhanced metabolic activity, delayed apoptosis, and a novel transcriptional signature. So these neutrophils are not at all normal. They are activated and they cause neutrophil traps. Okay, and these neutrophil traps actually want to sequestrate the bacteria, but they can also cause lung injury because they produce these chromatin fibers, etc., etc. So the neutrophils have a major role in the production of ARDS apart from the macrophages. There is also an involvement of the ACE pathway, like the ACE pathway, the angiotensin converting enzymes cause proliferation and fibrosis. Remember how we talked of cardiac failure, where there's a remodeling. The ACE pathway is also involved probably in the remodeling of the lung. And this is again a future target. If you want to prevent the fibrosis in the lung, probably you should target the ACE pathway. Okay, so that's another thing that is coming up of late. Now, what is the consequence of all these things that we said? There are three consequences. Number one, there is impaired gas exchange because you have flooded the alveolar membrane and the interstitium, so oxygen cannot cross there, carbon dioxide cannot cross there, so you have a hypoxia. There is a diffusion capacity reduction at the alveolar membrane, impaired gas exchange. There is a decreased compliance because you've got a flooded lung, it's a wet lung, it's a heavy lung, it's a stiff lung. So you have decreased compliance. Then you got increased pulmonary artery pressure. Remember, we told that there is a coagulation going on. So because of that, there is all the pulmonary capillaries are occluded, and so there is an increase in the pulmonary arterial pressure. So you got a decreased gas exchange, you decreased compliance, and an increased pulmonary artery pressure. Now, why do we get the decreased gas exchange? Because of VQ mismatch and increased dead space. VQ mismatch is related to the filling of the alveoli and the shunting that happens because the pulmonary capillary walks through a completely damaged alveoli. It's now, which is not putting in oxygen at all. So shunting causes hypoxemia. And there is an increase in the dead space, again related to the VQ mismatch. And this ultimately will cause impaired carbon dioxide elimination and results in high minute ventilation. So this is the impaired gas exchange. The decreased compliance, like we said, because of a non-aerated lung, boggy lung, stiff lung, and requires much more pressure to deliver the tidal volume. And like we said, vasoconstriction because of hypoxia, positive pressure, remember, causes vascular compression, your positive pressure by ventilation, I mean, and all these can result in right heart failure. So all components are affected equally. Question coming up, which of these is the most important feature of ARDS? Bilateral lung infiltrates, hypoxia, fever preceding breathlessness, requirement for mechanical ventilation. It's a no-brainer. It's hypoxia. Now, why did I put up this slide? Because I want you to understand that the theme of ARDS is hypoxia, hypoxia, and hypoxia. That's the most important. Like when we say, what is the theme of a nephrotic syndrome? It is proteinuria, proteinuria, and proteinuria. Like that, in ARDS, there's only one word that we have to remember, and that is hypoxia. And like we said, the hypoxia is because of multiple factors: alveolar damage, capillary damage, leakage, inflammatory cells, VQ mismatch, atelectasis, decreased compliance, increased dead space, vasoconstriction. Everything causing one ultimate result, and that is hypoxia. Of course, on the capillary side, small vessel thrombosis, increased dead space, hypoxia, respiratory failure. That's coming from the vascular side, right? And the differentials are anything that causes left heart failure, like left ventricular failure, mitral stenosis, pulmonary veno-occlusive disease, lymphatic spread of malignancy, interstitial or airway disease, like we said in the ILD. These are all the differentials. Now, moving on to the phases of ARDS, we have three phases: exudative phase, proliferative phase, and the fibrotic phase, which are all mentioned everywhere. So I'll be just, and I think it's already taken for you in your previous classes, but we know there's an acute phase and the late phase. The acute phase is the exudative phase, the first 4 to 7 days, when you have the exudation, where there's a diffuse alveolar damage and fluid leaks out. And then you have the proliferative phase, where there is a proliferation of the type 2 cells and fibroblasts and alveolar fibrosis. And then over 21 days, there is a lot of fibrosis. You are seeing a lot of patients post-COVID coming with interstitial fibrosis. This is in the proliferative phase after 21 days. And that is what is represented here. Initially, you have edema, later on you have hyaline membranes, then you have the interstitial inflammation, and finally you have the interstitial fibrosis. So there are different phases of ARDS, and each of them will require a different type of management based upon when you see the patient. So the acute exudative phase is what looks like pulmonary edema, where there are multiple infiltrates, and the infiltrates may be asymmetric, and pathologically they look exactly like pulmonary edema. In the fibroproliferative phase, you got a fibrosis in alveolitis, what you can see in the pathology here, persistent hypoxemia, decreased lung compliance, and pulmonary hypertension because of obliteration of the capillary bed. All of them will cause right heart failure. And the fibroproliferative phase, we can combine both, where you start seeing chest X-ray showing and pneumothorax is more common, CT scan showing bilateral infiltrates, etc., etc. Right. Of course, there is a recovery. We do find people with ARDS recovering and going home, right? How does this happen? Because once the hypoxemia resolves, as the edema resolves, and there is reabsorption of fluid by the sodium chloride transport and the aquaporins, which reabsorb the fluid. That's what causes the decrease in the fluid content. And the protein is removed by endocytosis. And of course, there's a reepithelialization of the denuded alveolar space by type 2 pneumocytes, which differentiate into type 1 cells. And so there is removal of the fluid, there's removal of the protein, there is regeneration of the type 2 and type 1 cells from the alveolar epithelium. And that's how the patients with ARDS recover from an ARDS at the pathology point of view. Moving on to investigations in ARDS. We divide them into microbiological investigation and imaging investigations. Now, microbiological investigation, of course, since we said sepsis is the most important cause, blood and other fluids are important for you to make the diagnosis of sepsis, gram positive, gram negative, whatever. Sputum is difficult because most patients will not give. ET culture is probably better. BAL care is done for fungus like PCP and then Legionella and other nocardia, actinomyces, etc. Bronchoalveolar lavage is done when you want to differentiate for other things like the interstitial pneumonitis kind of diseases, and of course PCR for COVID-19, H1N1, etc. can be done. The problem with the X-rays, like we said, they can be patchy, asymmetric, they can be inconsistent, there can be pleural effusions, atelectasis, or tumors. Very easy to define and say you must rule out all this on a chest X-ray is not so easy. So that's where the CT scan scores. You can see the diffuse infiltrate on a chest X-ray, but beautifully seen on a CT scan here. And in the fibroproliferative phase, where you start seeing the kind of fibrosis, the interstitial fibrosis, which is barely seen on a chest X-ray, seen very well on a CT scan. Right. So I'll go through a few chest X-rays for which I want you to write down the diagnosis. Now, please write down the diagnosis for this chest X-ray. This is a patient who had ARDS and she was intubated. Yeah. So this X-ray shows this part. That is the pneumothorax. Okay, fine. This is a bit of the collapsed lung, right? Some part of the lung is collapsed. It's still lying there. One part. This is all pneumothorax. There is a severe, big time mediastinal shift and a tracheal shift. You can see the tube here, probably tracheostomy tube, and the heart is completely migrated to the right side, and that's why you're not seeing the heart here. She's not a heartless woman. The heart came here, and you can see the big time pneumothorax that happened. And this, she was on the ventilator when this happened, and this is showing a left-sided pneumothorax with shift of trachea and mediastinum to the right, probably a tension pneumothorax. One more X-ray. Okay, let's see whether you got this. How many of you made out two tubes here? One tube is here. The other tube is here. So this patient of ours actually had two pneumothorax, one on the right side, one on the left side. Okay, and you can see the small remnant of the pneumothorax here, but there and maybe here. The rest of the lung is expanded, but you can see the bilateral infiltrates here, almost becoming like a fibrosis, right? So this is a bilateral pneumothorax in a patient who is again intubated and has got probably lung fibrosis. That. All are related to ARDS. So you can always write ARDS. Since nobody is watching, you can write whatever you want. Okay. Now look at this. Definitely there are white shadows here and here, and they're not looking like soft shadows. They're looking like more definite shadows. Probably there is some amount of exudation, some amount of fibrosis. But what is amazing in this X-ray is this. That's a pneumomediastinum. That's a pneumomediastinum, which is quite common in patients with COVID. You saw it during your COVID times, where patients in many ICUs went in for a pneumomediastinum. You can see it bordering the mediastinum here and bordering the heart here, bordering the heart here. Okay, so it's an ARDS with a pneumomediastinum. One more. Okay, this is the X-ray of the same lady who developed the bilateral pneumothorax. She was one of our success stories. She lived with us for nearly more than 3 months. We, in fact, celebrated her birthday in the hospital by cutting a cake. She was a young lady, and she walked home after so many complications. And this is her X-ray at the time of resolution. You can see the nice fibrotic phase of ARDS. You can see the lines here of fibrosis. That's how a fibrosis of an ARDS looks like. Okay. So this is the fibrotic phase of ARDS where she has developed some amount of interstitial fibrosis. But actually this lady, in spite of having this kind of an X-ray, she did not need oxygen when she came to see us. She was walking, talking normally. And so the X-ray was showing a scar, but patient was actually fine, except for minimal limitation of exertion, right? Otherwise, she was fine. This is one more of our patients. I put it up because this patient also had a H1N1 ARDS, which went on for nearly 2 months. And I used to follow him up in the OPD. And he came to me for nearly 3 months. He was on steroids. And slowly there was resolution. And this patient also, I could taper the steroid and stop. You can see the fibrotic shadows here. He also had interstitial fibrosis. He was desaturating on walking, but he kept improving. So there is a lot of hope in patients with ARDS, even with COVID ARDS. Over a period of time, people do recover and come out of their interstitial fibrosis, and the lung does probably, come back to normal. Right. Now, moving on to CT scan in ARDS. CT scan is probably one of the best investigations in an ARDS. You can see the alveolar edema here, the ground glassing here, and then the fibrosis, the traction bronchiectasis, and the good amount of fibrosis, and also the air bronchogram here. So everything is made out. It does rule out pleural effusion, it does rule out atelectasis, and all the caveats in the diagnosis for an ARDS on a chest X-ray are taken care of. Like I said, you can see the ground glassing, the fibrosis, and the air bronchograms. All of them are seen better on a CT scan in COVID times, right? The problem with the CT scan is shifting the patient down, up, wherever you want, for the CT scan coming out is a problem. But the advantage over chest X-ray is severe pleural effusions are ruled out. Severe obesity and all you can't make out on the chest X-ray. Nodules, masses, interstitial lung disease are much better defined on a CT scan. Now that's where the ultrasound comes in. Of course, ultrasound can identify the B lines, but the point is the B lines don't help you to differentiate between an ARDS and a pulmonary edema. Both will show B lines. So that's the problem. Sometimes the ultrasound will not have good quality of images because of a thick chest wall, obese patient, etc., etc. And like we said, and cannot differentiate an LV dysfunction from an ARDS. So it's useful for you to follow up the patient, but not really useful to make a diagnosis of an ARDS unless you have ruled out cardiac problem by other means. Okay, that's about the investigations that we do. Now we'll go on to probably the more important part of this lecture, which is the concepts in management. And like I told, though I said I'll talk about pathophysiology and its impact and challenges in management, I'm combining both because they are almost cannot be separated, inseparable. Whenever you look at an ARDS, okay, fine, you have to ventilate the patient, you have to get the patient out. But if you are stuck in a maze, okay, what is the way out is what you have to think, and that is treatment of the cause. So if you have identified the cause, for example, you identified it is COVID-19, and then you put your remdesivir, steroid, whatever, okay, anticoagulation, whatever. Like you have identified it's H1N1, then you have given your oseltamivir, whatever, leptospirosis, whatever. That cause or the gram-negative sepsis, that is your way out. So always remember that treating ARDS does not stop with only ventilation, whatever. It always depends upon the cause, and identification of the cause is as important as managing a patient with ARDS. Now, when we come to management, the big problem with ARDS is how do we come out of this ARDS? That is important. Okay, how do we come to the end of ARDS? That route is also important. Like it is said here, whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster himself. Okay, which is what happens when we are ventilating a person with ARDS, which is what brings us to what we call as ventilator associated lung injury, which brings us to the question, did we produce an ARDS? Many times we have done it. While treating an ARDS, we produce an ARDS. Okay, that is because we have forgotten that the alveolus is not some balloon or a sac for us to go on, expanding and contracting. It's not a balloon, it's not a sac. It's a living membrane capable of producing all kinds of cytokines and active substances. So when you go and distend an alveolus, you're not distending an inert sac, you're distending a live membrane. And not understanding this led us to a lot of trouble in the past. So this is a 2003 paper, if I remember right, and it talks about, in retrospect, it seems almost irresponsible that we didn't publicize our concerns that such ventilator patterns might be harmful to humans. This was a study done by them in rats. And when they did not recognize that there was an entity called ventilator-induced lung injury, they did not know that. They actually, when they did experiments in rats, they did not publicize it. They thought it's only in rats, and that they, in retrospect, they regretted not publishing this, because if you see, within a few minutes, in 5 minutes, if you give a high pressure, then peak pressure, then you get the bursting of the alveolar membrane, which happens in 5 minutes. Okay, so that's the kind of damage we can do by ventilating wrongly. Now remember, the ARDS lung is a heterogeneous lung. Okay, the ventilator is going to pump the same amount of air, the same amount of pressure to all parts of the lung. But the ARDS lung is a heterogeneous lung. It's got normal alveoli, it's got injured alveoli, they are capable of participating in some amount of exchange, and it's got damaged alveoli which cannot participate at all. So you've got 3 types of alveoli sitting there, and that is your heterogeneous lung in an ARDS. But what happens when you ventilate all parts of the lung with the same force? Then you get different types of trauma. The high inflation pressure, which is called barotrauma, the over distension, which is called volutrauma, the repetitive opening and closing of the alveoli, which is called atlet trauma, and the cytokine release, which is called biotrauma. Okay, it's a good article on this, though it's a little old, it's a good article which talks about the different kinds of trauma that we produce by the ventilator in an ARDS. That's the diagram, I mean, the photographic representation of what happens after mechanical ventilation. This is a rat. After 5 minutes and after 20 minutes, you can see the completely distended lung because of volutrauma, which happens when you unnecessarily put a lot of volume into an ARDS lung. This is the beginning of the damage. This is the end of the damage. The time required is only 5 minutes and 20 minutes. That brings us to what we call as the baby lung concept. In an ARDS, the normally aerated tissue has the dimensions of a lung of a 5 to 6 year old child. So that's all the area that's given to you for ventilating. That's called the baby lung concept in an ARDS. Remember, it is heterogeneous. So some parts of the lung are non-distensible. Some part of the lung, the normally aerated lung, is a small portion that we have to deal with. Now, one thing that happened to us after we got the CT scan is to categorize this heterogeneity. Now, as you can see, in an X-ray, you can hardly make out which part of the lung is kind of involved. But when you do a CT scan, you can make out that when you came from the apex to the base and when you came from the front to the back, you had a heterogeneity and you had a lot of damage at the posterior portion of the lung, which is what shows you that there is heterogeneous lung. Anteriorly, the lung is more aerated. Up, the lung is more aerated. But as you go down and as you go posterior, the lung becomes stiff. But what is very interesting, which is again showed by Gattinoni, who became famous during COVID for coming back to the L and H lung. This is a very much earlier publication by Gattinoni, which shows so beautifully that when you put a person supine and then you prone him, the shadows move. right? So you got the shadows here, they moved, okay? And then you brought him back to supine, they came back to the bottom, right? So it moves. So what does this tell you? This tells you that this baby lung is stiff, is not stiff, but it is small. It is not stiff. It is not that this is a permanent damage. This is not a permanent damage. So not a permanent damage, it moves when you change the position. So it is not stiff, it's a small lung. It retains normal intrinsic elasticity. So it's a big relief for all of us because we can recruit that lung. Now, if we say that this is the final thing and this lung cannot be recruited, we have to give up and manage only with this lung, right? But we know that this lung is actually normal. And if you change the position, it will come back to normal. So it is capable of being recruited. That is the brilliance of this experiment by Gattinoni, which showed that the baby lung concept may be there. Maybe it's a small lung, but it is not a stiff lung. It is not something that you can give up on. Now that brings us to the concept of low volume ventilation. Now, like I said, the pathophysiology is linked to the management. So that's why I'm telling you some of these concepts. Why do we need a low volume ventilation? You remember your plateau pressure, the pressure at the level of the alveoli, right? So plateau pressure is equal to tidal volume by compliance. In ARDS, compliance is low, right? So we must reduce the tidal volume. Otherwise, you'll get a high plateau pressure and you'll get a barotrauma. That's why you need a low volume ventilation, and there must be a gentle treatment of the baby lung. Remember, the baby lung is a normal aerated lung. So you go and pound it with all kinds of things, then it's not I'm sorry, not the baby lung, the less aerated lung. If you go and try to distend it, the baby lung will actually burst because it is not so stiff. It is not, this thing. Its compliance is good. It will go in for a pneumothorax. So this is the Gattinoni revival of the L and H lungs, which talked about the compliance and the elastance being variable in patients with COVID-19. And he said some patients with COVID-19 actually can tolerate higher tidal volume, okay, and a better PEEP rather than the H type, which, they require more PEEP, etc., etc. So for the same type of PF ratio, you can get different types of lung as shown in the CT scan, which is what Gattinoni said. And he said that we must ventilate them differently. And of course, he brought this concept that not everybody requires a high PEEP because some of these patients, the hypoxia is not coming from the alveolar side, it is coming from the vascular side, isn't it? That's what changed our ventilation in an ARDS in COVID, because we realized that not everybody is got that high PEEP requiring stiff lung. Half of them have got a thrombosis on the other side. So these are the people who require more anticoagulation and not so much of a PEEP because they will cause barotrauma otherwise. So this different phenotype of COVID-19 patients was revived during this episode of COVID-19. Now let's look at some of the problems we will face during ventilation. 65-year-old man with ARDS with FiO2 of 0.6 and a PEEP of 15 is found to be restless and sweating. His saturation drops to 82. His tidal volume is down to 200 and peak pressure, plateau pressure, both are high. What is the diagnosis? So you got four options here: tube leak, tube block, pneumothorax, bronchospasm. I suppose all of you have managed patients with COVID-19. So on the ventilator, so you're capable of interpreting that. You also had a class on ventilation. Right? The answer is C, pneumothorax. A tube leak will cause less pressures. A tube block and bronchospasm will affect the peak pressure, not the plateau. Both are affected means it's affecting at the level of the lung. It's a pneumothorax. Okay. So this is the barotrauma that we are all worried about. When you are ventilating patients with a higher PEEP, which is what you need to prevent hypoxia, then you can get into a barotrauma. So how do you recognize a pneumothorax on the ventilator? How do you recognize a barotrauma? You recognize it by ventilator asynchrony, acute elevation of plateau and peak, and sudden decrease in the delivered tidal volume. But probably the most important is a clinical observation, right? If you stand at the foot end of the bed and watch the chest. One chest is not moving and your patient is restless and sweating, you're probably dealing with a pneumothorax, right? So that's a very important. I have seen one of my assistants make a spot diagnosis of a pneumothorax without anything except clinical observation. Okay, so that's very, very important when you're dealing with a pneumothorax. Of course, the elevation of plateau and peak and decrease in the tidal volume can make a diagnosis of barotrauma. So, like we said, you have a volutrauma, you also have a barotrauma, which can happen because you're using a higher PEEP. Of course, you can do an ultrasound for an ARDS and look for the absence of lung sliding, and there are no comet tails. This is the pleural membrane, which has become a single membrane. And sorry, this is the only one thing that is seen. There are no comet tails and there is no lung sliding. That's when you make out that there is a pneumothorax, which can be made out provided you have a good ultrasonal sonography person, and also the patient is not having a thick chest wall, etc., etc. So this can also be used to make a diagnosis of barotrauma. But barotrauma exists. That's why you had that class on ventilation. We talked about how to avoid barotrauma. You should not go beyond 30 plateau pressure, etc., etc. Okay, right. Now, when we manage ARDS, like we said, to avoid the volutrauma, we are keeping the tidal volume less than 6. To avoid the barotrauma, we are keeping the plateau pressure less than 30, and respiratory rate, we don't want him to get exhausted, and we don't want a high minute ventilation. We're keeping it less than 35, and we oxygenate with an FiO2 of 0.6 and saturation between 88 and 95, and we minimize acidosis. But what I want to draw your attention to is the dry lung policy. Okay, the ARDS lung is a wet, soggy lung, and a wet, soggy lung is difficult to distend. Once you can't distend it, you're going to have more hypoxia. So better to diurese. Okay, watch your map, avoid hypoperfusion, but keep the person with ARDS a little underhydrated so that you don't have this problem of wanting to distend a wet, soggy lung. So that's also very, very important in your management. Okay, so we go to the next problem. Respiratory failure in ARDS is type 2 because of increased dead space, type 1 because of alveolar integrity lost, initially type 1, then type 2, initially type 2, then type 1. So you have to choose one of the 4 options, right? The answer is C. It's not type 2 alone, okay, because you can't get type 2 initially, at least. Initially, it's always type 1 because, like we said in our previous class, whenever there's an alveolar integrity problem and there's a diffusion problem, oxygen is the most affected. Carbon dioxide will still cross because it got a much better diffusion capacity. So you always begin with type 1 in any form of alveolar problems. But later on, even the carbon dioxide cannot cross. There'll be more dead space, there'll be more shunting, and then you would get more carbon dioxide rise. That is because you have damaged the alveolar membrane so much that even carbon dioxide cannot cross, which is what I showed you in the last class when I showed you 2 horses trying to jump over a fence. Okay. It never initially type 2, then type 1. This is complete nonsense. Just I couldn't find another option. That's why I put it, right? So the answer is C. So ARDS is always about hypoxia. Later on can become hypercarbia also, but the theme of ARDS is always hypoxia. That brings out us to the targets. What are the targets in an ARDS? We're always worried about hypoxia, right? So that's what you're worried about. How do we get out of hypoxia? Because hypoxia can kill. So what's the oxygen target in ARDS? Now, this is a very good article. I would recommend you to read. It's an editorial from the chest, which talks about what should be the targets of people who are critically ill. Emerging data and state of equipoise, which balances less oxygen and more oxygen, right? Remember, oxygen can cause toxicity, okay? It's not the more the merrier, and you put an FiO2 of 80, 90 like that, and you walk off. That is not good because it can cause reduced microvascular circulation, Free radicals can be released by oxygen, which can also cause lung injury, and systemic inflammation can also occur. So oxygen is not without its toxicity. So then what is the best oxygen target? Now there were two trials that were done. One is the oxygen ICU trial, one is the oxygen ICU ROX trial. Now oxygen ICU trial found a surprisingly large difference in ICU mortality in the conservative group. That means those who had less oxygen given to them, they did much better than who had given more oxygen, right? So they said, please give less oxygen. The ICU ROX trial, which talks of 1,000 adults on mechanical ventilation to a conservative target and the usual target, no guidelines, no difference in ventilator-free days and survival between randomized groups. But there was significant heterogeneity of treatment effect with conservative oxygen therapy. So this did not find any difference. This found a big difference. Okay. In the absence of subsequent data, still the oxygen levels are to be maintained at 93 and higher. But like I said, this is from Gattinoni in an article that he released recently, but the jury is still out. We are not very sure because still we do not have randomized control trials which take into consideration the heterogeneity of ARDS. Now, a person with ARDS, young man, leptospirosis ARDS is very different from somebody who has got sepsis ARDS, very different from somebody who has got polytrauma ARDS. These lungs are different, okay? And so much of the other things that you do in an ARDS will come and confound the effects, okay? So that is why it's not easy to get these results, and so the jury is still out. And I would recommend you read this review by Gattinoni, who's talked about ARDS, and this is his this is his statement that we recommend 93 and higher. There are other people who say much lower is okay, right? Fine. But like I said, jury is still out, not sure. Okay, come to the next problem. Identify the correct statements. More than one statement is right. Increase in inspirated time will increase oxygen. Increase in expirated time will increase carbon dioxide. Increase in expirated time will cause autopeep. Increase in minute ventilation will decrease CO2. Since you already know ventilation, I think this should be easy. I am giving this problem to explain a concept, that is all. So just read it and think and write the answer. More than one statement is right. The answer is A and D are right. Increase in inspirated time obviously will increase oxygen, right? Because you're giving more time for oxygenation. Right? Increase in expirated time will not increase carbon dioxide, it will wash out more carbon dioxide. Increase in expirated time will cause autopeep. No, autopeep will come when you don't give the time person time to expire, right? When you don't have enough expiration, that's when you get autopeep. Increase in minute ventilation will decrease carbon dioxide is right. So that brings us to a very simple logic that I think we should all know. When you want to increase oxygen, what do? You give a higher FiO2, you increase your PEEP, and you do an inverse ratio ventilation, which you increase your inspiration more than the expiration. Normally it is 1:2, you make it 2:1, right? So increase your FiO2, increase your PEEP, make it inverse ratio. That's how you want to increase your oxygen. The disadvantage of this is that less expiration, less CO2 washout, permissive hypercapnia will set in. They're not giving time for the carbon dioxide to go out. Increased intrathoracic pressure will be there, less perfusion will be there, and you will generate an autopeep because you're not allowing enough time for expiration. You're compromising the expiration because you are increasing the inspiration. Okay, fine. So let's see whether you understood this. This is a question. This is one IE ratio. This is inspiration, this is expiration. This is another IE ratio. Where will you use this IE ratio? Where will you use this IE ratio? Write one condition for this, one condition for this. That's, I think, pretty simple. Now, this IE ratio is simpler for you. This is a long inspiration and a very small expiration. So this patient is hypoxic. You have given him FiO2 increase. You have given him enough PEEP, still not oxygenating. You will increase his inspiratory time. This is an inverse ratio ventilation where the inspiration is more than expiration. Where you want to lengthen your expiration is when you have somebody with a COPD who can't expire. So if you go and decrease his expiration, you will cause more auto PEEP, okay, and you can increase your intrathoracic pressure, things like that. So that is why you want to give him time to have his expiration. So anybody with a prolonged expiration, you would give more expiratory time. You can go from 1:2 to 1:3 also in people with severe bronchospasm. But I wanted to show you this is what we use in ARDS. We use an inverse ratio ventilation because we want to increase the time for oxygenation. Now, this is a very important statement that came in. In our opinion, the real revolution was not the use of the low tidal volume, but the change of goal. Okay, for nearly 20 years, this has been normal gas exchange. But from the 1990s, the accepted target being gentle lung treatment while maintaining oxygenation and accepting high PCO2. Right. So one of the first things that came on was the low tidal volume. But the later on, what came on is a change in the target for oxygen and for carbon dioxide. What came on after 20 years in the 1990s is that you give enough oxygen, you accept the high PCO2, which is what you call as permissive hypercapnia. So like you have two enemies, hypoxia and hypercapnia. Whom are you more scared of? Hypoxia, isn't it? You are always worried about the hypoxia because that's a bigger enemy, right? You identify two enemies and then you choose your bigger enemy and run away from him, right? So you do not want hypoxia. You accept the little higher carbon dioxide because, like we said in the last class, carbon dioxide is a narcotic. Carbon dioxide is a narcotic more than a killer, right? So you worry about the carbon dioxide when it changes pH, okay? When it has consequences, then you worry about. So you don't accept severe respiratory acidosis, no. But you take it easy on the carbon dioxide by giving an inverse ratio ventilation in which you give more importance to the hypoxia, less importance to the hypercarbia, which is what you call as permissive hypercapnia. But you worry about it when the pH drops. And of course, it's contraindicated when you have a person with a stroke with an ICT and all. You don't want more carbon dioxide, right? Carbon dioxide is a cerebral vasodilator. It will cause more ICT and severe pulmonary artery hypertension also you don't want. Okay, fine. So you are compromising on the carbon dioxide, accepting a higher carbon dioxide, which is what somebody asked me in the last class, I think. This is called permissive hypercapnia, which is a strategy that changed the ventilation strategy in an ARDS. Okay, fine. Now we look at another problem. 45-year-old man with COVID-19 ARDS is hypoxic on ventilator with an FiO2 of 0.8, PEEP of 15, PF ratio of 130. The next step is sedate and paralyze, prone, increase FiO2 to 100, increase the PEEP. Okay. The answer would be prone, right? Of course, you can't increase PEEP. You go on increasing PEEP, you'll have a problem. Can go up to 20, but not really great. The FiO2, like I said, you don't want too much because you can have a hypoxic injury, right? Sedate and paralyze may be okay. Actually, I could have put that also as an answer, but I wanted to show when we prone. So that's why I gave the PF ratio of 130. So somebody asked me about proning last time. Okay, I'll spend about 2 minutes on proning. Why prone? Why are we proning? We are proning for two reasons, for hypoxia and for survival. Why do we prone for hypoxia? Because we know that hypoxia improves on proning. Even awake proning has been tried in COVID, right? Even those who are not on ventilator. And the second thing is, does it improve survival? That's another question we have to ask. So I want you to look at these two figures, okay? None of these is my own, okay? Most of it I have tried to read from the articles which I showed you. They're all brilliant articles. I enjoyed reading them. I wish you do. read them because they are really, really nice. They have different takes on all these problems. Okay, fine. So when you are supine, right, that's your heart, these are your lungs. Okay, so you are actually compressing some part of your lung because your heart is there. Okay, and that is your lung capacity. Your lung capacity is 38. Now look at what happens when you prone, right? When you prone, you take off the weight of the heart. Okay, take off the weight of the heart, and so you get a little release. The lung actually releases itself a little, and your lung capacity actually improves, right? The lung capacity improves to 56.9. So you know that you can read this thing statement, which is very nice. The open non-dependent lung mass at 50% of the sternum vertebra distance, that is this distance he's talking about, okay, is about 40% of the total mass, while the dependent accounts for 60%, right? The dependent portion accounts for 60%. As collapse is primarily a function of superimposed hydrostatic pressure, including the weight and shape of the heart, which is mainly located in the left chest side, it follows that while prone, more mass opens in the non-dependent zones than collapses in the dependent sternal zones. So when you're doing this, there is a collapse, right? There's a collapse of this part, but you're opening up so much more on the other side that it works. Fine. So you know that you are opening up more lungs simply because there is one diagram. If you understand, you will understand that, okay, when you're putting the patient down, you are compromising the expansion of the front of the chest. But fortunately for you, you're opening up much more behind than you're collapsing in front, right? That's what this diagram shows you. And like I said, the weight of the lung, the heart and the abdominal contents fall forward. When they fall forward, when the weight of the abdominal contents fall forward, the diaphragm moves down, you get more lung capacity. One of the things that we always worry about it, what happens to the vasculature? Do you think that the vasculature usually, it goes on the dependent portions? So maybe you will compromise the vasculature. I did not put up those lines from this article, but it says that when you measure the vascular capacity, you find that it doesn't change that much. Okay, doesn't change that much. You still have enough blood going to the back. Okay, you still have enough blood going to the back, so you're not producing a VQ mismatch of a major kind. Okay, and you're decreasing the heterogeneity of the ARDS lung by proning. But forget about ARDS lung. Even an awake proning, this is how it works. Okay, so for hypoxia, there is definite evidence. For survival, it's a plus minus evidence. Nobody has shown that when you prone, there is a survival advantage. There's an advantage for the hypoxia. Okay, right, fine. This is an excellent review. Again, I would like you to note down and read. Prone position, when, why, how, and for whom. It's a very good review. Again, it came out in Intensive Care 2020. The details are given there, right? Right. Now moving on to another controversial topic, which is steroids in an ARDS. Now, steroids in an ARDS, this is the article published in 2007. You can see the date here. Okay, Meduri is a person who produced so many articles on steroids in ARDS. Okay, and this was in 2007. He gave 1 to 2 milligram per kg of methylprednisolone for 7 days. And he said that there was a down regulation of systemic inflammation, significant improvement in pulmonary and extrapulmonary organ dysfunction, reduction in duration of mechanical ventilation, ICU length stay. So he said everything works for you when you give a steroid, right? But he was shouted at. Okay, when he told this in 2007, he was shouted at, and he said that there were many articles saying, no, steroid is a bad drug, we should not give it in ARDS, nobody will give it in ARDS, etc. So when the COVID came, this is your Meduri, and unfortunately I don't have the picture. I got a Twitter feed from a friend of mine who sent me Meduri holding up a glass of wine, okay, drinking away to glory, because he was proved right. When the recovery trial came, he was saying that I told you so in 2007. Okay, so he had the last laugh. The H1N1 experience is our own experience. I have used enough steroid in H1N1, and it's like pulmonary edema. When you give this steroid in a H1N1, the thing simply vanishes. The ARDS simply vanishes in 48 hours. Now, why I'm saying H1N1 is most of these H1N1 patients, they're a different category. They have a single organ failure, right? They have a lung failure. They are not bad hosts. They don't have hypertension, diabetes. They don't have, sepsis, some other comorbidity, CKD, CLD, nothing they have. They have a single organ. So there we have had good experience. Unfortunately, I have never published about this because I never did the study. But there are enough patients in H1N1 ARDS where we got away with giving good amount of steroid, especially in the first few days. The COVID recovery trial is what, like I told you, Meduri was toasting himself to a glass of wine. It's no more controversial that we can give steroid. But remember that steroid, again, COVID-19 is not, something like a sepsis ARDS. COVID-19 ARDS is COVID-19 ARDS. It's a single organ involvement, right? So I think you can't really, across the board say that everybody must be given steroids. No, it won't happen. You have to take into account the host. What is his, comorbidity? Will he go into, he may die of, sepsis because of steroid causing infection? Possible. It's a double-edged sword. So that is what I would like to say about steroid ARDS. This is a very good article again from Lancet Respiratory Medicine 2020, which asks this very pertinent question. COVID-19 associated ARDS is a different approach to management warranted, like what Gattinoni said, and Gattinoni became so famous for saying this. But what this article says is very, very balanced. It says that personalized lung protective mechanical ventilation reduces mortality and has become the mainstay of ARDS. It's not just in COVID-19. This HNL lung we always had, okay? We always had patients who needed more PEEP, patients who needed less PEEP. This always happened. It was highlighted during this COVID-19, that's all. So he talked about, he's saying like what he says, although early reports suggested COVID-19 associated ARDS has distinctive features that set it apart from historical ARDS, emerging evidence indicates the respiratory system mechanics of the patient's ARDS with and without COVID-19 are broadly similar. So what he concludes is, in the absence of evidence to support a shift away from the current paradigm of ventilative management, he strongly recommend adherence to evidence-based management informed by bedside physiology as resources permit. So he's saying use your common sense. You don't suddenly think COVID is different. COVID is not different. This HNL lungs were there always. It's a very good review. I would recommend you to read it. This is a table I took from the same review, which talked about what is the timing of intubation, what's the tidal volume, the PEEP. So he talks about the timing of intubation. Again, he says that consider it when you have refractory hypoxia or hypercapnia. The tidal volume, he says you can liberalize the tidal volume, can go from 4 to 8, especially if you have a lung which is quite okay, it's not very bad. Then you can, which are good compliance, then you can go up to 8, he says. And he talks about the individualization of the PEEP. Don't give high PEEP, low PEEP for everybody. Use the PEEP, check your parameters, then readjust the PEEP, etc. And prone positioning, he says when the PF ratio is less than 150, and then he talks about ECMO in the last. But it's a very good review, very sensible, balanced review from the Lancet Respiratory Medicine. I think this slide you would have seen, and the ventilation slide that you got, you initially start with lung protection, then high PEEP, then the paralysis, and then the proning, the recruitment maneuvers, the high frequency oscillation ventilation, inhaled nitric oxide, and the ECMO, which is what we do. All of them have one theme, come out of hypoxia. All of them have the same theme, right? Okay. Now, what is the mortality in ARDS depend upon? Depends on direct lung injury versus systemic. People with direct lung injury, much better prognosis. Etiology, of course, reversibility, age, comorbidities, duration of ICU stay. Longer you stay in the ICU, more bugs you will get. Mortality is quite high, okay? These are common sense features that we see. But I want you to answer this question. What is the commonest cause of death in patients with ARDS? Hypoxia, barotrauma, hypotension, sepsis. The answer is sepsis, right? Okay, I'll tell you why. Most patients with ARDS die of MODS. They do not die of hypoxia. Okay. That is where the fourth trauma that we did not talk about, the atelectotrauma and the biotrauma hypothesis, saying that the alveoli, stretching the alveoli itself can release inflammatory mediators and leukocyte recruitment, which is why most patients with ARDS die from MODS rather than hypoxemia. Now, that's very, very important to remember. That's why I said getting to the end of hypoxia is not the goal. How we get there is as important as reaching the goal. Because while you are getting there, you may produce more ARDS and your patient may die because of what you did rather than what the patient came with. Okay, that's very, very important. Remember, the alveoli is a living membrane, and biotrauma, you can see that when you are having biotrauma, you can get an increase in TNF alpha, 1 beta, IL 1 beta, everything can increase because a low stretch ventilation limits the ventilator tidal volume and plateau pressure, was associated with reductions in the concentrations of all these things. Okay, so death by sepsis is because of release of inflammatory markers, because we made this mistake of thinking the alveoli is a balloon and the endothelium is a tube. Both are not. Both are living structures capable of releasing multiple chemical substances into the circulation, and that's a basic mistake that we made, which we are realizing now, that we should be careful with the way we ventilate an ARDS lung. Now, apart from all this, okay, there is a mortality which is affected by genetics. Okay, the genotype of polymorphism of the AS gene may be a predictor in Asian population. So apart from all these things that we are talking about, like I said, the host factors have never been studied. So we know only one half of the story. The other half of the story is waiting to be discovered by your generation. When you come up and become consultants, probably you should be looking at and telling how we can modify the genetics of ARDS. The long-term consequence of ARDS are chronic respiratory disease, muscle fatigue, muscle wasting, weakness, and cognitive impairment for about 2 years. Okay, so all these things are possible. You know the post-COVID syndromes that we are talking about. So many people are coming with that, etc., etc. Now, another future direction in which we go is molecular targets for therapy that can lead to endothelial and epithelial barrier stabilization. So, can we stabilize the endothelium or the epithelium by some molecular strategy? That is the next step in what we are thinking of, because we have got receptors here, we got signaling pathways here, we have got this barrier stabilization here. So there's a cytoskeleton there. So maybe we can do some things here, which is the next step that will come in an ARDS therapy. So there are many ways at the way we look at it. Now, is that the last word on ARDS? Because the more I think, the more confused I get, isn't it? Now, I want you to go through this because we come from the developing world, posing a metaphysical question. Do we all live in the same world? When we talk of literature that's coming from the West and what we do in India, and what we do in India is also heterogeneous, because some ICUs have very good facilities, some ICUs have nothing at all. So if you read this, is it possible in the era of increasing high-tech medicine to define diseases and their severity with technical devices, lab values, sophisticated measurements, but not available to everybody? Okay. So scientists who are producing these guidelines, is it an illusion that they are working about the same topic? Because they are talking of all kinds of measurements being done, which nobody does. Okay. And the first world medicine, the second world medicine, and the third world medicine, is it possible to come out with the guidelines which are similar? Many times when you read the guidelines, you know that you can never do it in your setup, right? So we have to evolve our own guidelines based on what we have, and everything need not be so technically sophisticated. It's not needed. We can still do a good job. That brings us to what we call as the Kigali modifications of the Berlin definition, which again came out in thoracic disease, where they replace the common PF ratio that we talk about by a SF ratio less than 315. So you don't have, an ABG done. You can go with your saturation of less than 315, which is good enough. Okay. We eliminate the PEEP. We do not even consider the PEEP as one of the definitions. Echo is not done, you go clinical because it's not available. So third world countries and some centers, even in India, will be going with this, and we have to adapt to this. Okay. Now, lastly, what are the things that we agree upon in ARDS? What are the things that we do not agree upon? So the consensus in the middle: limit tidal volumes and passive pressure, goal targeted sedation, and if PF is less than 150 prone, consider neuromuscular blockade, right? If sustained this thing, consider ECMO, less than 80. This is something that everybody agrees on. When to allow spontaneous breathing, timing of intubation, not sure, right? Nobody is sure, right? Especially in COVID, we tried to delay intubation. We did get a good result by delaying also, right? Personalized ventilation, driving pressure, do we do a CT scan in everybody, look at their PF ratio and then look at the CT scan and then choose the ventilation mode? Not sure. Therapeutics, steroids, not sure. Attempt to treat all patients similarly or separate into biological groups, which subgroups predict treatment response? Not sure, right? So we got all these blue things about which we are not sure, these few things in the middle which we are sure about. To summarize, ARDS is a consequence of several infections and infectious conditions. Ventilation has to be gentle. We have to avoid barotrauma, volutrauma, eclectotrauma, and biotrauma. All four traumas must be avoided. And changing concepts, because we are now saying we can change the tidal volume, we can change, we go with permissive hypercapnia, we are coming with lesser and lesser oxygen targets, etc. And maybe we will change the host at some point in time. The most important thing is this sentence: intensive care is founded not only on a great idea, but on near paranoid attention to detail and understanding of the minute-to-minute changes in the patient's physiology. I firmly believe that a doctor in the ICU should be continuously monitoring the patient, continuously changing strategy, outthinking ARDS, outthinking the whole pathophysiology of it. Otherwise, the patient will not improve. So it's the paranoid attention of the ICU consultant which saves lives more than anything else. Thank you.